thinking. There we go. All right, we're live on YouTube. And then let me just start broadcasting here. And we are live on Zoom, and our attendees are joining us now.
Brian, is it okay to go ahead?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, I just want to say, hey, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to have Eugene Poirier here that's going to speak on the struggles for Black lives, a historical perspective on our contemporary movement. And I connected with Eugene several years ago. He was a keynote speaker at the Equity and Social Justice Conference at Virginia Commonwealth, continually sparks around social justice activism, political activism, intellectual, cultural worker. So his work has been admiring and transformative and inspiring to many of my students and colleagues across the United States. And before we move on with Eugene, I just want to give a few thank yous and an acknowledgement. And then my colleague, Derek Ford, will give a proper introduction to our esteemed colleague, Eugene, tonight. So the first thing I want to do is give a land acknowledgement. And the acknowledgement is this: I respectfully acknowledge the traditional customs of the land in which I live, love, and work, and pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. The first thank you I wanted to give is to my colleagues in the Educational Leadership Program. They supported Eugene's talk, but more importantly as well, they're people who are committed to social justice and equity through their teaching, research, service, and cultural work. They're committed to preparing leaders who will eliminate opportunity gaps impacting the BIPOC learners and other minoritized learners. So it's been a great year working with my colleagues in the Educational Leadership Program. Another important thank you goes out to Heather Latimer, the Dean of the College of Education, as well as Associate Dean Marcos Pizarro. And they've given unwavering support to the Educational Leadership Program, not only sponsoring Eugene's talk tonight and lecture, but they're unwaveringly committed to faculty engaging in research, service work, cultural work, to ameliorating institutional forms of oppression. So I appreciate and admire their leadership. It's been an absolute pleasure with working with esteemed colleagues. And the other thank you is really to my colleagues on the executive board at San Jose State University. And they put together this resolution. I'll read one sentence of it. It's a lot longer if you want to look at the resolution of the union on San Jose State's university website. We condemn all acts of police brutality, racial profiling, and the use of excessive and militarized force throughout the country and the California State University system. I also want to thank Brian, specifically the Strategic Communication and Signature Experiences Coordinator, who continuously supports me in this work to get the word out in messages and activist activities that we sponsor in the College of Education, and particularly into the EDD Educational Leadership Program. And finally, I want to thank Derek Ford, who's going to introduce our esteemed colleague, Eugene Poirier, tonight. He's been a great friend, colleague, activist, scholar, and intellectual. He works at DePaul University. He's the assistant director of the Educational Studies program, and he is here tonight. And thank you again, Derek, for reconnecting me with Eugene. I look forward to your introduction to Eugene, and thanks so much for everyone joining us tonight on YouTube and through this live stream. Thanks again.
Brad, do you want to go over the announcements real quick before we get started?
I can't see them, so let's see what the announcements are. Brian's going to show them. Okay, here are the announcements. Yeah, the recording of this event will be available afterwards, and it'll be on YouTube. Captions are available in the Zoom webinar, and it will be available after this recording. Also, attendees' video and audio are automatically turned off. Please use the chat to communicate with one another with the panelists. And Brian will be fielding the questions at the end of Eugene's lecture. And Eugene, again, will answer questions about his remarks. And now Derek will give an excellent introduction to our esteemed colleague tonight, Eugene.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Brad. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks, everybody who had a hand in organizing this. I always date Eugene when I say this, but we first met when we were both undergraduate students. It was during the war against Iraq, really the second war against Iraq, and Eugene was heavily involved organizing the nationwide protests, some of them the largest anti-war protests in US history. And he visited my university to speak with the group there. And we've, really been friends and comrades ever since. But I think more germane to this setting here, over the time that I've been friends with and I've worked with Eugene, around 13 years now, he's continued to be one of the most important and impactful teachers in my life. I mean, as you'll see, his mind is quite something. I've only met really one or two people who knows as much as he does. And whenever I spend time with him, I love asking him all the questions that I've been thinking about, but haven't been able to answer or haven't been able to find the resources to answer. He always knows both of those things, so the breadth, the depth, and flexibility of his mind, I think, is really truly singular. But of course, being smart in itself isn't necessarily a good thing. And so I think Eugene's intelligence and his mind is always organized around and guided by how he can advance the struggles for justice and liberation that he's participating in, that he's leading, and that he's supporting, in his own communities across the nation and really across the world. His book, Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, which came out in 2013, and I really think today remains the best resource for understanding racist mass incarceration in the United States today, even better than many of the popular books that may be more popular for a reason. But he's an organic intellectual, right? I mean, he wrote the book without an advanced college degree, and he wrote it not to advance his own ideas, but to give expression to the movement as a whole and to intervene in the movement as a whole. And I think that intervention still is really important today. And I really recommend that people check out that book. So, he continues to teach me content, but he also teaches me in two other ways. I mean, first, he teaches me how to be a teacher. Even with all of his knowledges and experiences, Eugene is incredibly humble and self-reflective. In fact, often when I ask him a question, he first asks me what I think about it. And as I'm sure you'll see today, he continues to critically assess his own actions and knowledge, as well as the actions and knowledge of the movement as a whole. He also continues to teach me what it means to be a leader. And I think Eugene is really an organic leader. He never formally studied it. He never did an EDD in leadership. And I think the first public speech he gave was to a crowd of like hundreds of thousands of people in DC at an anti-war rally. There's little preparation you can do for this. He just did it. He took the risk, he made the sacrifice, and he went for it. But he's also always learning about leadership by studying others in the movement, both present and past. He's always reflecting on his own leadership, his own participation in movements and events. And his leadership is not one of imposition, but one of collectivity. And so he's taught me that to lead means not only to constantly learn and reflect, but also to give others the chance to lead. It's necessary for movements to advance because leadership is always collective. And it's not about a person or a personality, right? It means being in constant negotiation with all the different forces and elements at play, and in many ways serving as a mediator between them without abandoning one's own convictions. So Eugene's leadership, it isn't about Eugene or what's best for him. I mean, I believe, and I think you'll soon agree, that he could probably make an incredibly lucrative life as a public speaker, leading workshops at university with hefty price tags. And it's not to discredit those who do that. We've all got to, make a living, but he's a real selfless leader. He asks what's best for the movement. Sometimes that means taking a step back or remaining silent or behind the scenes. And so he teaches me what it means to be a leader by always learning and reflecting on his leadership, again, from the perspective of the movement as a whole. And just as an example of this, after organizing with the Answer Coalition and the Stop Police Terror Project DC for over a decade, he also hosted an amazing podcast, By Any Means Necessary, a daily podcast for several years. And he moved to DC, from DC to New York City recently to start a job as a journalist with Breakthrough News. And this entailed a lot of sacrifice on his part, but he didn't hesitate. It was where he needed to be. It was where the movement needed him to be. And so he went there. So, that's why I didn't want to introduce him by just sort of going through his various accolades and his various achievements, because I don't think that's what really defines him as a leader. And I don't think that that's how he defines himself as a leader. And after, over a decade of friendship and organizing alongside Eugene, I'm genuinely thrilled to hear him speak every single time. And I'm rarely as attentive in a lecture as I am when I'm listening to Eugene. So with that, please help me welcome Eugene.
Well, Derek, I appreciate that. That's a very humbling introduction, and it does feel so appropriate in so many ways. To start where you did, where we first met. I think the use of a formal educational space for maybe a popular educational activity, I think is an interesting thing to reflect on in terms of how those of us who are popular educators and formal educators interact in the context of the institutional position, either in a higher institution of higher learning, or in lower levels, K through 12 or whatever it may be, and also community spaces. So I thank everyone at San Jose State University for making this possible. I am beyond thrilled to be able to speak to you all, and really just am hoping first and foremost that everyone is feeling well, is being as safe as possible, and definitely all my well wishes to everyone. Obviously, this is a tough time we're in, and it's I've been reflecting on so much, I have to say, in preparation for this, because even just thinking of the topic of education, which in and of itself is so huge, your mind just starts to wander in a million ways, and you want to put together 4 talks in one, and you have to figure it out. And I've been thinking so much kind of along 2 tracks, of course, in the course of the week or 2 leading up to this, and thinking about sort of education as an idea, as a concept, as it relates to social movements, in particular popular education, and what from my own view, I feel that the overall contribution that can potentially be made by those who really have sort of an educational, pedagogical background and experience. And then, of course, in this current moment, and which is so marked by the uprising against racism that's happening in this country. I mean, I think it's deemed many different things, and goes under many different flags and banners. The Black Liberation Movement, which, as the historian Vincent Harding says, there is a river, has been consistent since the first Africans were ripped from the shores and brought here in chains. That certainly, now the movement for Black Lives, BLM, whatever people want to call it, but I think we're seeing an uprising against racism. As much as we see the issue of police brutality, and I want to come around to a couple other points, but just to frame it here, as maybe the sort of leading issue, I think it's really just the bleeding edge of a much broader reality that I think is very clear to everyone who is watching and everyone who's participating. I mean, I've had the opportunity to be in the streets and at many events, both virtually and in person over the course of this. We were in Minneapolis with Breakthrough News. If folks want to check us out, at BT Newsroom across different platforms, you can see what we did in Minneapolis. But I've also been in many different places. And the one thing that I think has been very clear and very consistent is, as much as the rallying cry is around and in favor of justice for those who have been victims to this wave of police terrorism, and I think that's the only way to put it. Someone said to me the other day, do you realize that under Obama, the police killed 8,000 people? And I just thought, wow, that's like not that long of a period, 1,000 people a year. That number hit me in a big way. And I think that oftentimes brutality, other things we can use as shorthand. I'm not really trying to make a big point here about language, but I do think sometimes people are taken aback when you say things like police terrorism, but I think we have to be realistic when you look at the number of people being killed, the millions of people being subject to humiliating, degrading stop and frisk policies. But be that as it may, that in this moment, that it also makes me think, obviously, of course, of the role education has consistently played as a feature and a touchstone of the Black liberation movement. So sort of beyond the maybe general theoretical concerns of social movements and educational concerns and where those cross over, but the reality of the actual struggle to learn and the struggle to gain knowledge being so crucial. I mean, obviously, the struggle of slaves was so heavily around the ability to gain knowledge, to read especially. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons perhaps of the struggle of enslaved people, is the value, I think, of knowledge as a weapon in real life. I mean, you know, it's a profound thing when you want to keep tens of millions of people from knowing anything at all. I think that's a profound statement about the role of knowledge in liberation and self-determination. But, you know, be that as it may, thinking of how all these things cross over, and I want to sort of get into my talk, but the one thing that just kept sitting with me when I was trying to figure out how these things were coming together, these different concepts and these different threads, was one story, an interesting story to me, about the civil rights movement and about the spirituals that come in the civil rights movement. I think a lot of people here probably know the famous civil rights song, "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize." And it's also, of course, a famous and fantastic multi-part documentary series, which I think is on YouTube now. I'm not 100% sure on that. Someone will have to check me, but I think it is. And if you haven't seen it, please do. But Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, which is a sort of adaptation by a woman named Alice Wine, who was working in, you know, a place called Johnson Island, South Carolina. It's in the Sea Islands. It's something called the Progressive Hall, which was an educational facility, essentially, that was set up by a guy named Sal Jenkins, who was a civil rights leader in this area. He set up this school in 1948 on the recommendation of Septima Clark, who people may have heard of, who of course set up the famous citizenship schools for SCLC all across the South, but including here and most notably in South Carolina, that trained hundreds and hundreds of activists who would then go back into their communities, rural people mainly, and help be really the backbone of the fight for the right to vote. Septima Clark, of course, told Sal Jenkins to link up with the Highlander Folk School, which is in Tennessee, and was really a product of the radical upsurge of the 1930s against the Depression in the South. The mine workers in the eastern part of Kentucky and West Virginia, the textile workers in South Carolina, the tobacco workers and the sharecroppers in Alabama, in Georgia, in Southern Virginia, also in Arkansas, tenant farmers mainly, the cigar rollers in San Antonio and Tampa, you know, really this kind of unknown. I see my camera is getting a little ridiculous here. Hold on. Okay, this sort of unknown in many ways, you know, side to some degree, I think, of the story of the 30s and the story of the labor movement, of these, you know, very heavily rooted in these deeply, deeply oppressed and exploited, oftentimes, you know, Black communities in the South. Nevertheless, the Highlander Folk School emerges out of that struggle of workers and farmers to establish a place where they could meet first and foremost, and have some sense of security, to engage in, of course, reflection on past work, also to learn from different individuals who are coming from parts around the country about sort of theoretical aspects, and also to do a lot of cultural production. And a big piece of the Highlander sort of philosophy is the interweaving of education and culture. And I think the deep touchstone between the two, and the way culture is often, you know, an instrument of education. And so Highlander is really often a pioneer of the transposition of work songs from the slave plantations into struggle songs of the Black liberation movement. And there's a number of songs that have roots in this lineage and history, and Keep Your Eyes on the Prize is one of them. But Alice Wine, Johnson Island, Progressive Hall in South Carolina, Sal Jenkins is the founder of it. And this is in the context of the citizenship and civil rights programs. And Keep Your Eyes on the Prize is a transposition of an old slave work song. And anyone here who's a gospel fan, I know, knows this song, Keep Your Hand on the Plow, most famously sung by Mahalia Jackson. Many would say the greatest gospel singer of all time, certainly the queen of gospel music, who, among other things, was also deeply involved in the civil rights movement. So you see how things are sort of crossing over here. And, you know, in the context of this, you know, traditional gospel spiritual, but it was really a work song in many ways, and certainly a song about the condition of slavery based on some traditional Bible verses about looking forward, not looking backwards. I think that it's interesting to also note that then the most famous practitioner of this song is also deeply involved with the SCLC and Dr. Martin Luther King. And I bring the story kind of around in full circle here a little bit to say that when we talk about the impact of individuals in the movement who you never fully hear about in critical moments, someone like Mahalia Jackson, who's famous mainly as a gospel singer, not as a civil rights activist, but the role she played in also the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And I'm going to wrap all this together in just a second, but to finish the story out, and I think to see a lot of these different points and connections here, obviously a certain percentage of that speech that Dr. King gave, 50th and 7th anniversary of which was just about a week ago, most of it was scripted, but towards the end, he got off on his sort of just a rhetorical flight that anyone here, I think, who speaks in public knows that can happen when you have a spirited crowd that's in front of you. And you sort of start to hit a moment, but you're off your text. So you can't really go back because you're going to drop the energy, and then you've lost the whole sweep of it. And I think so much of the element of a public speech is not the words themselves, but the reason I think people come together to feel that they are a part of a collective and not alone in their shared beliefs is powerfully represented, of course, in song, and I think also in the sort of call and response nature of a rally speech. And so you got to do something. And Mahalia Jackson and Dr. King had been traveling around a lot because she was very, very committed to doing work for the civil rights movement. And so they have a good relationship. They know each other very well. And obviously somewhere in there, the elements that became the sort of famous "I Have a Dream" elements towards the end must have been part of some conversation, because as Dr. King starts to get there and maybe lose it, she can feel it. Obviously someone who has experience with preachers, and she yells out from behind him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream." And he goes and does the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So, it's moments like that you never hear of that are interesting. But you think about, the most famous practitioner of hands on the gospel plow, giving this great moment to maybe the crowning figure of the civil rights movement, who has embraced another version of this song, a transposition really of the soul culture of resistance of hundreds of years of enslavement into what at least many people felt was the final push into freedom in ways that no one had ever expected. And that right at the center of that, you have the Progressive Hall and the Highlander Folk Center, and you can see the impact of the popular education of formal, practical, professional educators embedded in social movements, fighting against all cost in the Deep South to develop these really liberated zones to some degree in order to have these areas of knowledge production that kind of knits all of that together. And you can see the deep touchstone between education and culture and social movements in the driving spirit and the driving force that really makes, obviously, the movement that does what it does and we remember so well, but I think speaks more specifically to social movements, to the spiritual core, if you will, of that allows it to maintain its strength. And I think it's important to reflect on sort of the practice of education outside of the formal sense, and how that plays out. And I think in our current moment, that is tremendously relevant in terms of how we see ourselves, either as, any of us who feel we can be educators, which I think everyone can be an educator. It really is incumbent, I think, upon us to have that kind of philosophy. Maybe the final thing, I'll get to one of the point I really wanted to make here, on that point of everyone being an educator, the famous phrase that many people know, "Each one, teach one." Now, no one really knows where it comes from. It came up apocryphally, anecdotally, through slavery somehow, some way, and became a major force in the Black community. Many people know the phrase have used the phrase. It's still in use today. But one of the things that I always think the most about in terms of its impact is in South Africa, in Robben Island, during apartheid, that became the rallying cry of the political prisoners, was each one teach one, because the original ANC lifers, Nelson Mandela and the others who were convicted in the Rivonia trial, ultimately were, many of them were like the leadership of the ANC. A lot of them had the opportunity to be educated. But as the mass struggle grows and many more people get sent into the Robben Island, into the prisons, many of the people are illiterate or very poorly educated. And here they are. They don't know how long they're going to be there, but obviously they want to continue to sharpen their skills to be able to struggle against this apartheid system. And one of the most important things, the key touchstone they analyzed, was the need for everyone to, of course, engage in the practice of education, but to make sure that no one was ever left behind. And so when they would send them out to the rock quarry to break out the rocks, which is what they had to do, they would always put someone who had had like a college education with someone with a lower education to work together. And then they would teach them somehow, some way, however they could figure it out in that time, among other things. And today, even if you go to Robben Island, oftentimes they'll tell you that story, people who were there, the ethos and the importance of education to the incarcerated folks there who were struggling against apartheid. So, I say all that really just by way of maybe introduction, and I won't try to talk too long here, but it's interesting and difficult to try to bring together the threads, I think, that are running through all of this. That was kind of my conclusion when I was making notes, because the current moment right now is so explosive. It's a moment of interlocking and overlapping crises. I mean, it can be witnessed in so many ways. I mean, if you look at the level of human devastation that exists right now, and then you look at the skyrocketing stock market, if that isn't an indication of the, just grotesque crisis that we're in, I really don't know what else is. That at the time of the greatest misery, some of the greatest wealth can be reaped at all times. Something isn't right there. But obviously there's so many things. I mean, tens of thousands of people dying in a pandemic, the uprising against racism in this country. Of course, the sort of overarching crisis of climate change. I mean, I'm still stunned thinking back on how just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the possibility of maybe 2 category 4, category 5 hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast. It didn't turn out like that. Although, quite frankly, a lot of places got hit harder than is really being said in the news. But be that as it may, I think that just the fact alone that was happening, right? At the same time, wildfires are ravaging California, and of course the pandemic, and of course the uprising against racism, and of course the deepening and growing inequality, tens of millions of people unemployed, tens of millions of people growing in poverty. Perhaps there will be some sort of ban on evictions for some period of time, but a looming crisis of eviction and utility shutoffs and people just being thrown out in the street. Small businesses, 1/3 of them maybe wiped out forever. I mean, you put all these things, they're all happening at one time. Plus now with the sharpening of the contradictions, you have the rise of political violence. I think in the United States, in some ways, this is very shocking to people. And in many ways, we've been lucky that, sort of political violence has not been as much of a feature as it is for some people around the world, where even the most basic things that we consider easy political activity or even educational non-political activity, even just to talk like this, could get you gunned down in the street. And I think now we're starting to see in the United States, a deep sharpening of real, armed clashes in a lot of ways between the state and different people, between militias and certain individuals. And I say all that not to make a big statement about it, but just to throw something else into the mix that's obviously happening. And I think when you put all of that together, I mean, it's difficult to find the exact through line you want to speak to in reflecting on the moment in light of any theme, because it really feels like so much of this is we're trying to make sense of just the everyday in any way, that trying to find some way to unify it around a theme is difficult. But I think looking at the sort of base reality of what we know, I think I can say 2 things. One thing quickly and another thing a little further that is maybe what I want to end on. And I think the first thing is in that context and speaking on the stories I started with, and I say, that's why I say by way of introduction, that the importance of a spirit of popular education, I think, is more important than ever. Because ultimately, when you look at the durability of movements, and I think that's a question that has to really be asked now. I mean, I think when you look at the challenges that are facing us in terms of all these crises, the solutions for them are not easy. For first and foremost, obviously the entrenched interests that they represent, but also secondarily, the real profound questions we have to ask ourselves when it comes to, living in a profoundly different way where there's more equity, more equality, more social justice, and, sustainable living. We live in the opposite of that now. And I think that's clear to people. So it's one thing to say that, but I think it's a whole other thing to think about what it means to sort of turn that around. I mean, that's a major societal, social, cultural shift. And I think the role of popular educators in giving people the tools to understand the reality that's around them is more critical than it ever can be. I was reflecting on two different moments from when I lived in Washington, D.C. recently on this basis. And I'll just speak to them in the most general sense. One was lobbying with some public housing residents and the DC City Council, and the other, the experience in the zoning commission, dealing with trying to fight gentrification. And one of the things that has always been most interesting to me about my relationships with the people we were working with was how much, in terms of what they were expressing to me, the most valuable element of it in many ways was, I always tried to make a big deal in our organizing of educating about whatever I could find. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm trying to just figure it out myself, but I have certain things I'm privileged to be blessed with over time that have allowed me to be able to figure some of that out and then transmit it to people. But really the understanding of the process, because a lot of these bureaucratic things are actually not even that complicated, but you just have to kind of weed through what it all is. But it's designed to be demoralizing as kind of like a maze in terms of how it really operates. But it can be figured out and it can be taught to people. And I think, unfortunately, in the current landscape, a lot of times you have a vision of quote unquote advocacy, certainly from a paid foundational funded perspective. I hate to be that blunt, but it's true, that I think develops a big divergence between their clients and the people who are the organizers, where sort of institutional expertise lies in one place and kind of emotional sob stories to legitimize the institutional expertise resides in another place. And I did top and bottom on purpose there. And people are not really empowered to engage themselves. And it's always just something that it's interesting, because I say all that to say that it feels like to some degree you're constantly losing, because obviously the tide of gentrification significantly, this is 3 or 4 years ago in DC, is overwhelming. But how appreciative people are of feeling like they are able to at least understand, engage, and fight back in a way that's intelligible to their neighbors and the broader community that can build a bigger fight and involve many more people who are in a like situation. And I bring that up because I really do feel that this is an amazing opportunity that exists right now, where I think people are willing to organize and mobilize in ways they never have, and are going to be looking to fight back in different ways, and are going to be creating spaces and structures and coalitions and organizations that I think have a deep, deep need for, not just the issue of education in terms of the knowledge itself, but the pedagogical aspects of it, the structure of educational practice that can create the Highlander folk schools, the progressive halls that can weld the cultural, folk knowledge, expert knowledge, and strong purpose into something. I don't know exactly what we want to call it, but the ability to create those spaces and to have that particular expertise. So I speak to you tonight in that sense as well, as someone who is, also, I feel, trying to do some popular education, but have always been a grassroots organizer is the importance of the particular skills and knowledge you have in your developing, not in the knowledge of necessarily individual subjects, but in the ability to structure and create spaces and practices that can certainly give people the tools to empower themselves and interrogate the social problems that confront them. I think the construction of that element is so key and so crucial and so deeply embedded in all of the most successful social movements throughout history and even currently today. You talk about the cultural educational concept and the deep sort of touchstone of culture as an educational mechanism. The landless workers movement in Brazil, the MST, who I've been pleased to have some engagement with, is, some of the cadre there, they say that political education is more important than eating. And, the role and the importance of knowledge production and translation throughout the base and the top to bottom of the organization is very deeply melded. But I say all that to say is they have sort of a phrase. It's a little hard to translate in a way, but they call it mystica, and it's sort of the formation of the educational process with a deep embedding in the cultural background of the people who are coming together, and not only sort of their kind of folk culture, but the culture of struggle that they're both emerging from and that they seek to be in solidarity with. Again, it's a little hard to explain, but I say all that just to say that, it's one of the most central pieces of the organization. It's 1 million people strong, one of the strongest movements of peasants and rural people anywhere on the planet. And they're constantly struggling against these massive landlords to redistribute this unused land primarily and to farm it collectively and cooperatively using sustainable organic practices and embedded in networks and markets of solidarity with the poor and oppressed people in Brazil and also around the world, because they have international reach with their products, as people who know the MST know. But be that as, I just wanted to say that to say, you can see sort of the movements that I think can fight the hardest, that have the deepest resonance in their communities and the biggest potential for change, always have deeply at their sort of taproot popular education and spaces where that sort of reflection and melding of the cultural, social, and political elements can take place. The second piece I wanted to speak to is, I think, sort of a slightly different element, but I think one that's a little bit more connected to my second theme. I said I was thinking of 2 themes, and that was my sort of pitch along sort of the practice of education and how I think it fits into the idea and the concept of all these social movements that are sweeping across the country. What is the role of educators and those who are being professionally trained as educators in these spaces as people who want to make change, which is the first role, first and foremost, and the thing that I think unites everyone who strives for social justice in this world is, our participation on that level beyond whatever our individual skills are. We all have something to contribute. But I think there's also a separate aspect to this that I think is relevant to my second theme, the role of education as a feature of the Black liberation movement and as a touchstone as the nature of the struggle. Obviously, Reconstruction is a great example of that, where the struggle around public schools is essential in the main struggle. Of course, the civil rights movement that starts with Brown v. the Board of Education, but where the issue of school integration becomes, in many ways, the issue that opens up so many other things on so many planes, including economic justice and the like. But that being said, I think, beyond just the issue of how it broke out in Brown, and of course in Little Rock as well, you have the issue of the citizenship schools, as I've already mentioned, the freedom schools run by SNCC, in Greenwood, Mississippi. One of the main elements that SNCC was able to bring to the table was education for high school students. That's how they were getting a lot of high school students involved in the organizing around the right to vote, is that they were tutoring them in these freedom schools and, helping them in their normal studies, but also infusing it in the broader social struggle. And many great strugglers certainly come out of Greenwood. But the role of the freedom schools in the rural areas as a form of knowledge transformation. We think of this, and I think today we're in kind of a different position, and I think it's unfortunate. I actually feel that the struggle around the right to education as a human right has been deeply downgraded. I think, in fact, the language of the importance of education as a foundational thing of society has almost in a way been hijacked and been turned against the idea of universal, popular, high quality public education. And really it's almost been weaponized in the so-called school choice movement. I mean, I know I'm speaking in California, so maybe this is controversial, I don't know, but here we go. I think it's unbelievable to me that we can shoot a rocket into space and have some robot land on the surface of Mars, but we can't figure out a way to educate children at the highest possible level in their own neighborhoods. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. It's a fake problem. It's a decision that's been made to not put the correct resources into the issue and in a societal structure that's told not to really value education at the end of the day. I mean, if education was as important as all the people say it is, when they get up and speak to politicians or whatever, people who donate to colleges and universities, principals and administrators, whatever. I mean, this is not to rip any individual person, but everyone always says education is so important as a society, quote unquote. But if that's true, how come our heroes are not educators and educational support staff, but instead we're taught to revere the Wall Street bankers and the get rich quick people and the Jeff Bezos and the Amazons? I mean, the mark of success is wealth, not knowledge and education. The mark of success has no basis, in fact, on how your success impacts the lack of success and the real violence done to millions of others. Just ask the thousands of people being injured in Amazon warehouses every year, being pushed to the brink so Amazon can sell some dream of how quickly they can get you something and get you to sign up to yet another Prime plus plus, so that Jeff Bezos can be the richest guy in the world. And I think that ultimately, this has to be renewed. I think there's a real deep connection in what we have seen over the past 40 years, the quote unquote neoliberal era, in the destruction of public education, the defunding, forget underfunding, the defunding of public education, the closing of public schools, the attack on teachers. It's remarkable to me that teachers somehow have been blamed for the challenges in the public education system. I don't even get that deep into it, but it just makes no sense to me. I don't think anyone with any practical anecdotal experience as a student could ever possibly say that all of the problems in their school related to the teachers. Of course, not every teacher is great, but I just think that it's remarkable to me how much we have denigrated the profession of public education. People do not want to work in public education now. You have this massive sort of, I forget the exact word for it, you all know it, but the difference between what you can make financially compared to your other peers who are similarly educated, whatever that gap and balance is now completely and totally out of whack. So the incentives are against public education. I mean, really, people going into public education are true heroes, quite frankly, especially people willing to work in the toughest environments. And I think, deserve to have that recognition. And at the time of the return to school with COVID-19, really deserve that recognition and the importance they play and the role they play for us in our society. And to me, it feels that, the conversation around what it really means to have a more just society has to touch more on the issue of the deliberate denying of education to tens of millions of students. And now, of course, it's taking on a whole different dimension when it comes to the issue of the online learning. And people I saw the most heartbreaking picture of two young girls outside of Taco Bell trying to use tablets because that was the only place they could get the internet. And I just thought, you've got to be kidding me. In the richest country in the history of countries, these two young girls have to go to a Taco Bell to be able to go to school. Like, what on earth? I mean, it really is just one of those things that it maybe doesn't seem surprising because you hear stories like that. But if you take two steps back, I mean, the callousness of it, the violence of it, honestly. I mean, people don't want to use that phrase, But I think we should, when you think about the impact of the just, differentials of education that are being meted out in the context of COVID-19. But I don't want to get too far off the point here, although maybe that is the point in the context of the return to school and the conversation about the role of education, the role of public health, and what we can and should be doing, and how we prioritize educational labor. But I really do feel that it's a much more important issue. I mean, when you really look at the history, especially of the Black liberation movement, of the struggle for education, there's a direct relationship between the desire to keep the majority of people ignorant and the ability of a struggle of a community to form up and to fight back. And that's why education is always at the cornerstone of it. And I think it's no surprise that over the past 40 years of complete and total assault, especially on Black working class communities in this country, one of the main avenues of it has been to destroy public education. I mean, maybe it sounds conspiratorial, but they're doing it. And I remember Rahm Emanuel said this, right? In Chicago, they said, oh, you're closing all these schools. And he said, well, look, 1/3 of these kids are going to fail anyway. They're never going to make it. I mean, that's the real mentality. He was just willing to say it. And I think there's a direct connection between the struggle for that 1/3 of people, especially everyone, but especially that 1/3 of people, that I think it's obvious that those who run society have decided are just not going to make it and are not going to be served. One of the most shameful things I ever saw was, and I'll finish here, a few years ago, I was looking at the metrics in Washington, D.C. around what achievement level they wanted to have for kids in the foster system. And it was like, one of the metrics was, how many percentage of these kids do you want to have ultimately go to college? And the number was like 7%. And I just thought to myself, well, I mean, this is just like the goal. Like, this is not even the real, this is just what you're shooting for. And how do you not shoot for 100%? I mean, how do you have such a pessimistic attitude of just like, well, look, only 7% of them can make it to college? I mean, what a prejudgment that has to affect the way everything else in the system is provisioned and worked. And just the lack of care and just the extreme sense of abandonment I felt as not one of these people that was being communicated to these young people was unbelievable to me. And I really feel that there's a strong story to be told in the struggle of the fight for education as a human right, of young people who are so demonized in this country, excluded in so many different ways, treated and criminalized as thugs, without so much opportunity. The struggle around education and quality education as a human right has the ability to lift up those who I think have been the most exploited, oppressed, and marginalized, and whose voices most need to be heard. And I think really young people's voices in general aren't heard, but certainly not there. The voices about violence in Chicago and how people feel about the police when they say, oh, well, the community, Thomas Friedman had some article in the New York Times, oh, well, you want to win the election, Biden, listen to Minneapolis, where people don't want defund the police. And, he goes and he picks and finds some Black people who don't want defund the police, all older people, and no disrespect to older people. But, I've been doing this work for a long time. And the people who are the most victimized are the least likely to speak out because they're afraid to be targeted by the police when they say something. Because they are the ones who are being consistently criminalized. And so their voices are not heard and not counted. And then you can have some view that is just some outside agitator coming in here and making up defund the police or some crazy activist, and it doesn't have resonance in the community, which is far from true. And I really do believe that the struggle around and for, education and what people learn as well in the schools, which is crucial. And I can't say too much about that here. I think that's a whole other issue. But I think that's another important struggle, is the struggle around curriculum. But I really do think lifting up this fight for education as a human right is key to really touching on the real roots of oppression and exploitation. And I think lifting up some of those who, have the most to offer us from a societal standpoint, but are often rejected and not developed by those who are running things now. And I think the ability to have a transformational approach to society to put education in the center of it is absolutely crucial from a historical perspective. So, I'll just try to wrap it up there. More than happy to take questions and talk about whatever, certainly anything that was said here. Anything else that's on anyone's mind, for sure. Very happy to dialogue and discuss. Again, extraordinarily grateful to everyone at San Jose State to make this really possible. And I'll open it up.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Eugene. Really appreciate you just diving deep into that. I mean, sharing some of the context around the Black liberation movement, getting into the historical context, and then connecting that to intersectionality and what that means in our current context, and then diving deeper into education, public education specifically. We do have some questions that are coming in through the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and read one of them here. So I really appreciate your analysis and the importance of education. What we also know is that we are graduating students who went through the motions, took standardized tests, et cetera, and have never had access to a critical education that teaches about BIPOC history and contributions and social movements for liberation. What can you suggest that faculty in the College of Education work towards in preparing educators?
That's a deep question. That's a great question, though. I mean, I think that, yeah, definitely the going through the motions element of it. I mean, that's one of the major challenges right there, I think. I mean, how do we make, a good friend of mine, Jay Gillen, he's written 2 books, Jay, and now the 2 are completely eluding me. But either way, he's a lifelong educator in Baltimore City schools. And one thing that he says a lot, and that he says in one of his books, he says, we always say that young people and students aren't engaged. And he's like, that's not true. They're engaged, but they're engaged in what they want to be engaged in. And that's not necessarily the same thing as the school wants them to be engaged in. And I think that right there is sort of a key element for educators and to equipping educators when we're talking about Black and other oppressed nationality communities, because I think that is what so many young people are really kind of struggling with, right? Is not necessarily that they aren't, I mean, they're inquisitive, they want to learn, they're exploring many different things, whether it be, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get too deep into it, but, I think every sort of aspect of adolescence, right, is an aspect of education. And the things that students are engaged in is they're looking for some stimuli to meet their desire to learn and to grow and to see what's out there, and the limits to the body and the mind. And I think, how do we sort of recognize that sometimes those 2 things may not totally interlock, and how do we bring them together? I mean, this seems like a really small way, but I don't know if people here saw this. It was the most amazing video that went viral of this teacher. She had this whole song. They had a dance, the students. I can't even say it. And it was to like start off the virtual year, but it was like, it was hot. Like, I mean, I was sending it around to people and everyone was like, I love this. It's fantastic. But, it's like the exact type of thing that students are already doing. People creating TikToks, doing music. It also is relevant, obviously, to education, speaking to the issue of, hey, we're doing the virtual learning because of COVID-19, but it's important for us to be here. And by creating this sort of communal collective process in a cultural venue that already is something students are interested in engaging in, I think it helps create that sense of community that makes you really want to be a part of it, even though, you kind of have to go the extra mile. I mean, it's virtual, so it's easier to not be there in some ways than in, sort of normal times. And so I think kind of understanding that fault line is so key, and really being able to structure the learning process in a way that I think can really reach people. Because I think there's so many different, resources and pieces that we have to bring in depending on, who we're talking about and what the particular challenges are. But I always really appreciated what Jay said there, that, it's not that they're not engaged, it's they're engaged with what they want to be engaged in, and that also has to be given value and respect. And I think once we kind of understand that, it creates a whole new kind of mentality of how we approach engaging students, which I think, like all my favorite teachers are in many ways totally different. And I think if we all think about that, in some ways it might be the same, but they all found a way, I think, of connecting with us on a deeper level that I think was more about who we were trying to be as adolescents growing, not sort of who we were told to be, which I think is so often the way education is kind of at least proffered, and the way sort of the bureaucratic structures, no disrespect, of course, to all the fantastic people who work in administration, but just the way it is, sometimes can kind of enforce that, especially with the testing, which thankfully it seems now maybe we're kind of rounding a corner here where more and more people, I think, are starting to see that the standardized testing is just not where it is. But I mean, we'll see. But it seems we're getting greater traction on that issue, at least.
Awesome. Thanks for your response on that. Yeah, I like the emphasis on just engagement and really figuring out what's engaging for students, and really approaching it from a community standpoint. It was reminding me of just Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and just really trying to resist that whole banking model. So we had another question that came in. What are some ways to reconstruct the existing educational structures that we have, either things that maybe you've advocated for, or for folks that you've been in community with that they've been advocating for?
Yeah, I think a few things. I think there's two ways to approach it. I think the first way to approach it is, what can we do as collectives of individuals to create kind of points of engagement outside of the formal educational system that I think are knowledge-based for young people. And I think that especially in a moment like now, where so many young people want to be engaged in sort of social justice themed pursuits and are getting involved in movements, becoming politically aware, I think at a very young age now. It's certainly maybe much younger on average than when I was a young person, which is not that long ago. I mean, I'm only 34. I guess to some degree I am still young. I think that aspect of what's happening is an interesting fact, but it also then kind of creates sort of a new problem, which is in the same way we're talking about how do sort of formal educational spaces relate to students, how do you create in the midst of these movements the opportunity for learning experience, both for people, younger people, to sort of sum up in a safe way their own experiences and find some way to make that intelligible, but also to learn from those who have been there. And I say that to say that I think that that's just one thing I think to think about sort of individually, but it has an element of crossover into maybe sort of the structural formal space of creating things. And I'll go back again to Baltimore and other places where they have active chapters of something called the Algebra Project, which was formed by Bob Moses, who is a famous civil rights worker who founded SNCC. And the premise of the Algebra Project is more or less this. Since so many students are taught, right, you can never learn math and are so disempowered to learn around math. If you can master math, you can master anything. And the concept is they teach intensively math skills to high school students who then sell their services as tutors, oftentimes to college students, believe it or not, on math. And then they use the money, they run the whole organization themselves, to not only fund the organization, but to also pay themselves. So, they're coming from obviously backgrounds where that is important. And so they've integrated the ability to both find meaningful employment and engagement that oftentimes is necessary and helps them, feel great about who they are and their ability to contribute to their own families and their own communities. They're doing it in a way that's tied directly to formal educational achievement. So it's also sort of paying them in that way by giving them these extra skills. And it's also helping them learn all these different skills of what it means as a high school student to run an organization, to make a budget, to spend money. What do you do when someone doesn't do their job that you're paying, and all these different things. And so out of the experience in Baltimore, there is this new sort of thought process that's coming into being in sort of an embryonic way of how to sort of create that Algebra Project model in different ways, and how to see if there are ways for students to use the things they can do and that are interested in, that can be, or they can learn as a unique niche that can meet important needs for them outside of the school that obviously deeply affect their educational achievement, but that also start to create the possibility for greater, more cooperative business opportunities, so that they're not just thinking in terms of getting a job, but how to create development in their community through the course of these sort of educational come business entities. And I think it's an interesting concept, and I'm not really doing it justice fully here, but I think it really speaks to sort of the issue of not only how to engage students in the work, but how to really make the educational process sort of immediately relevant to their out of school life, which I think there's a relationship between the engagement and those two things. And what we see with the Algebra Project, I think, is it also has birthed and plays a big role in the protest culture of the city of Baltimore, because they also, one of the main things they do is advocate for educational equity, and certainly against the school to prison pipeline and different things like that. That's some of their main priorities, which of course they vote on and push on. But it gives this unique sort of it sort of situates the young people and the students in this unique nexus of community development, education, growing up, and also sort of political policy pushback to sort of change the things that have created the problems that their own existence is then reacting to. So it's an interesting feedback loop of kind of linking in education, work, and public policy that I think has been really cool and interesting that they've done with both the Algebra Project and a couple other things there in Baltimore.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that example with us. It looks like some people have some other examples that they're mentioning in the chat. Yeah, I like how you just touched upon, I mean, just really coming up with ways, opportunities that are, I think just with this response and your last one, talking about really centering the students and then thinking about building out the supports and the opportunities from there based on the students instead of the other way around, right? And you touched upon those other ideas of like making sure that it's relevant, connecting it to what this means outside of the classroom, and everyone's like daily lives and our lived experiences. If you all have any other questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. There were a couple of comments from earlier I'm going to go back to and turn them into a question. You've touched upon this theme kind of throughout your opening remarks and then the follow-up comments about self-empowerment and self-actualization and how there have been these tactics or things that have played out over the course of history, like denying people from access to information or knowledge as a way to kind of control that or disable people from self-empowerment and self-actualization. So people were in the chat talking about the connection between that and how currently there's kind of this one of the people in the chat called it like the war against like science and facts and those sorts of things. And so I was wondering if maybe you can comment on that a little bit, especially in your field, since you are a journalist and a community organizer. What's that looked like in your world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge in so many ways. I mean, certainly from the media perspective, sort of the war over fact and opinion. I don't know, maybe that's an eternal battle, but it seems now maybe more relevant than ever, since it seems like you can just sort of say anything more than ever and not really be checked. And I think, I'll take one step back and say the war on science element of it, I think, is actually very particularly crucial. I mean, I think that's one thing I've actually been thinking quite a bit about in the context of the pandemic, is where science fits actually in sort of popular knowledge and as sort of a building block of the things we know. I think especially, obviously always, but as science and technology become a much more bigger part of our landscape, I often wonder if we're really doing enough and demanding enough more sort of rootedness in the education system around that to teach people. And I think waging a struggle over that is obviously increasingly crucial, and figuring out popular ways to disseminate that is absolutely crucial. Ironically enough, maybe I don't know if this is slightly contradictory to what I said, but I do think some of the best things I've actually found for this are a lot of like teacher magazines for science disciplines often have a lot of fantastic popular articles about like very complex subjects. But be that as it may, I just say I really do think that this is maybe kind of it's so relevant because of the pandemic, I think, that I think it carries over into technology to really have people be able to be credible consumers of the things that are being thrown at them, the basic building blocks and understanding of, again, things that aren't, it's not like, people cannot understand them. They just have to be given the tools and the information that's put there. And I think that's how I feel a lot of times. I mean, I certainly have strong opinions about what I think about the different elements of the pandemic, but I always feel like I wish I knew more about virology or genes or vaccines or whatever it may be, as just in the same way I know, I don't know a lot about something that we know more about. But yes, so that's one piece. I think sort of the journalistic piece and the facts piece, I mean, it's an interesting thing because sort of objectivity as a concept, certainly like a journalism school concept, I think is now under greater examination than it's ever been before, because what is common sense really, and sort of the conventions of so many of our disciplines and professions, the common sense within them, I should say, is not really necessarily like the universal truth, but certainly perhaps what some people thought the universal truth was at some time. And they certainly had the power to make that the universal truth. But I think we've seen this in the battle over language around things like police involved in shootings rather than police murders, or however it's framed, or police violence, or however people are talking about it. and different elements of that. I think we've seen it in the big undercurrent of discussion amongst Black journalists themselves. How do you cover these issues when, how can you cover it objectively in many ways sometimes when you are the subject of the anger and the vitriol and the hatred of some of those on the other side, that if you're doing both sides, you have to give some voice to it. How do you give it a neutral voice as opposed to saying what you really feel and how through your lived experience it makes other people similar to you feel. So it's an interesting time because there are facts, but most facts are really subject to interpretation. You can have a fact, but oftentimes the way that fact plays out, the same fact, two people can use it totally differently. And so I think it's an interesting conversation that's being had in the journalistic world now. And I think it's one that carries over, certainly in a major way, to the historical discussion from an educational perspective. Really in the same way. I mean, history and journalism, quite frankly, have a lot in common. And I think that, we're seeing with the struggle over the statues, over the naming of streets and schools, other state buildings, and all these different things. I mean, there's so many questions over, what are the facts, but not only what are the facts, how are they interpreted? I mean, I'd say most people who are like defending Confederate statues aren't really being honest about what they represent. But, and I'll tell you, if you really want to know what they represent, most of them were built in like the 1890s and the early 1900s with the imposition of Jim Crow back on the South after the defeat of Reconstruction, like not right after the Civil War. They were being put up directly as monuments to the reinstitution of white supremacist rule over the South. That's unquestioned, well known and well documented. But be that as it may, I think some people who are a little more honest, and we've seen some of this in the discourse, will say, well, okay, we're not denying slavery happened, or that, this country is rooted in, they wouldn't say rooted in, but I guess I'll say rooted in genocide. But, it's sort of it was an original, it was a problem, but it was a flaw that we've corrected. And there was like an underlying, goodness and positivity there that has now overcome and overshined that. And now we're in a whole new era. So you can't really hold that against the United States. I think there's a whole other subtext, obviously, in this country that feels you can definitely hold it against, the United States and the people who perpetrated these crimes, and that absolutely they should not be celebrated, that their work should not be considered not irrelevant, but that they shouldn't be considered sort of, transcendentally great inherently in terms of being the building blocks, and that there are many other traditions, cultures, often subaltern, often the resistance to those who were instituting these laws, the so-called founding fathers, that deserve to be lifted up, perhaps, I would say certainly, over them and their own practices, beliefs, and procedures, a different type of history and founding ethos that really should be celebrated. And so the facts can be the exact same in some ways around slavery, around the genocide of Native Americans, around the brutality towards immigrants coming from Asia and Latin America. But the implications we draw from them can be totally different in terms of how we view that in relationship to the United States today, what the country is, what it should be, whether or not we should even limit our vision to the idea of the United States or start to think more globally and in a more cross-border way. We can have the same facts, but very different interpretations. So I think that's an interesting subcurrent. I don't know if that debate is ever really resolved in terms of what's neutral, what's objective, but I think it's exciting that we're having that debate, because I think it really means that you're getting to the root of what it means to interrogate the world that we live in and not just sort of accept what is as the boundary of what could be.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights. I appreciated you just, really approaching it from both the kind of macro level, really thinking about, objectivity and facts, and then even getting down to the nuance level, thinking about use of language, and then how those things kind of intersect with all these other dimensions of our political lives, our cultural lives. And who knows, that could just become more and more complicated as, there's just more and more information available through internet, social media, like all these other avenues. We did have a couple other questions that are trickling in, but maybe I just want to check on how we're doing in terms of time. Brad, I'm going to go ahead and just switch back to the gallery view, just so everyone can be in here. But how are we doing on time? Do we want to keep going a little bit longer, or how are we feeling?
Eugene, you want to do 2 more questions? Would that work for you? Do you have time?
I'm good. I got time. I can go. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. I appreciate it. I mean, I know if you're over on the East Coast, it's getting a little late over there. So,
Well, I was drinking yerba mate tea all day at work.
oh,
So
there you go. So you're gonna be up for
I
a
got
while.
another 2 hours to one. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. All right. Cool. So we have one question that came in. So I'm gonna read the question. Then maybe if the person who put it in the chat wants to elaborate a little bit, you can feel free. But it says thoughts on white teachers educating BIPOC students. And I know I mentioned that acronym earlier. So for those who are attending or watching live, BIPOC is an acronym for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And then the follow-up question is teacher needs and current impact. So I'm assuming that means like, what sorts of needs or what could be the impact when it comes to white educators and BIPOC students.
Well, I would look at the question in two ways. I would say the first question, the element of the question is, if we're recognizing that could even be a contradiction, it is a good reminder, I think, of the need to really champion, quote unquote, affirmative action. I would say equity approaches to higher education to really try to correct the deficits that exist in terms of who is teaching who in a lot of these classrooms. I think it's obvious there are not enough Black teachers, certainly Indigenous teachers, Latino teachers, and I think that without a doubt, there's only one way to really correct that, and that is to very intentionally construct whatever the mechanism we use, which is right now higher education, to get people into teaching positions, to just directly demand that be done and that be prioritized as a societal goal. I think it's absolutely crucial. And we seem to actually be falling further behind in that arena, which I think is challenging. And I think a lot of it is right now, a lot of it is rooted in teacher pay, I think. And I think that especially I can speak mostly to the Black community. I think the relationship pressure between what career you choose and your possible sort of financial earnings, especially people coming from lesser means, for whom they might not just be thinking about themselves, but what can they do and what can they give back to other family members who may really be depending on them. Those priorities can get skewed and it can be tough, even people who want to teach. I think that is something I have run into, even when I was a college student, people who are interested in teaching, but are worried that it's not going to really be a stable career and they're not going to really be able to have the type of, not living standard in the sense they're trying to live high off the hog, but that seems, most advantageous for the sacrifices that were made for them to be there, right? Because I think that's also in the mindset. A lot of people push for me to be here. I got to try to get the most out of it. I think that pressure is real. I think that pressure is serious. And a lot of people don't want to talk about like teacher pay now, because I think there's been so much demonization of teachers unions, but teachers deserve to be paid very well, much better than they are paid now. I honestly feel it's embarrassing actually that people in my profession, journalism, by far make more. I mean, you look at the people who work at MSNBC, Fox, CNN, they make more money probably by 100 times than any teacher in America. I mean, we're literally paying people millions of dollars to just sit on TV. And look, I'm not saying it's all easy. I sit on TV and talk, but I'm telling you right now, without a doubt, as you all know, it is 1,000 times easier to sit in front of TV and just randomly say what you think than it is to be in front of 30 students and to teach them, keep them engaged, and so on and so forth. And the fact that you can make $1 million sitting on TV, but no teacher in America makes $1 million. I mean, I think we really, if we want more teachers from more diverse backgrounds, we have to get more serious about teacher pay. I think we have to get much more serious about affirmative action. But that being said, there's also just the reality of where it is right now. And there are going to be white teachers, and a lot of white teachers in some places, who are going to be teaching students from non-white backgrounds, and oftentimes people coming from more class privileged backgrounds in a place where there's less of an alternative. And I think that this is, to me, this is the importance of the collective organization of teachers and educators, as much as any like one kind of silver bullet. Because my view is, how do you start to create a network and a community of educators where, even though there's not even though the students may not be able to see themselves fully in a teacher in any individual class, every teacher is embedded in a broader community, a professional community that is prioritizing, and I would say at all possible costs, by any means necessary, led by educators coming from these communities, thinking critically about these issues, developing curriculum, concepts, and so on and so forth, and being able to intelligibly articulate that and institutionalize that in terms of the practices and policies of education, I think that's the kind of interplay you really need to have in order to overcome, to the extent you can, the challenges you're going to have in terms of, not only students feeling connected to a teacher, but I think people being able to understand where their students are coming from and how to do it, and also how to really approach issues, I think, of curriculum and what students are taught in a critical way, and to really interrogate what's going on in the reading list and in the different pieces like that in and of themselves have a huge impact. I mean, so much of what you read over the summer in the class is going to stay with you for the rest of your life. And so even if one intervention someone makes is to get more, I saw Octavia Butler was on the New York Times bestseller list. If we can get more Octavia Butler in the English classes for people to read, that's going to make a huge impact in and of itself. But I think to have that kind of cultural competency, that kind of knowledge and awareness, it really only comes from collective communities, I think, of professional educators that can say, what's our problem? Who are the people who really know how to solve it? And how can we empower them to help us figure out how to do it? And then how do we discuss it and disseminate it and institutionalize it across our profession in order to be able to really make the strongest possible impact?
Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting kind of this tension between, like you said, the need to increase representation, especially among those who are from those communities, or who hold identities that are connected to the students that they're teaching. But then the tension between that and, like you talked about in your response here and earlier, just the devaluing of education and the defunding of education. How that kind of, there's that tension there, and even some of the things you mentioned earlier too, just how for a lot of students going through the educational system, it could be a particularly violent experience, or an experience where they feel criminalized, and so why would someone want to return to that type of environment? Definitely got a lot of shout outs in the chat for your last response there, talking about the need for better and more equitable pay. So for our last question here, we have is, what is your advice for someone in the earlier stages of community organizing with no prior experience?
Well, I'll just say real quick on teacher pay issue. I guess I'm kind of a ringer because my mom's an educator. So that's I don't know how neutral of an opinion that is, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate y'all. I think that's a great question. And I think that, the thing about community organizing is we all start from not having that much experience. And so I'd say the first thing is, don't try to initially reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of great work that is going on at the grassroots level, at the regional level, at the national level, on almost every issue. There's more that could be done, but oftentimes it's a matter of good stuff that exists on a small level scaling to a larger level, less than needing to kind of like find some new thing. And there's a lot of pressure in the context of nonprofit foundation funding to always create new things, which is its own problem. But I think, look for organizations, collectives, that are already working on the issue you care about first and foremost. And I think I say that because when you have very little experience, the best way to gain it is to start working with people who have similar goals and have been doing it for a longer time and can sort of impart that. But, so much of community organizing is trial and error. So much of it is just relationships and human relations. And so much of what a good community organizer learns, you really basically learn by not succeeding in different ways and kind of learning on the job. Because if you start to get involved in community organizing, the first thing you'll learn is there's plenty of work to go around. And even the most inexperienced person, if you are like earnest and you believe in what you're doing, people like me, we will throw you on the front lines and trust that you're going to make something happen. And so much of what is going to be learned is going to be right there in the thick of the struggle. But I think being embedded in a community of people, of organizers, on either one or numerous issues, of course, many groups, encompass many different issues in one, where you can take that experience, reflect on it, get advice, and also through the course of your own experience, add to those who are more experienced. I learn from people all the time in the context of organizing who haven't been doing it for that long. Someone might be on their very first day. We might be doing something as simple as knocking doors, and I'll notice they're getting a lot of signatures, and I'll say, "What are you saying?" And they have thought of some quick little rap that is getting people engaged in a way I never would have thought of. Right now, I have a whole new vision. So also I think just the experience of every new person who comes in this struggle also adds to our collective knowledge of organizing, which is really the most important thing, because all of us have many individual experiences, but I think to really make it relevant to how do you make change and like what is kind of the sausage making process of organizing is really only going to happen when we have a lot of data points from organizers, people who've been doing it just for a second, in the middle, or for a long time. But I would say look for a community of people and become engaged, and look to draw on people who are also generally interested to also become engaged with you. That's the first task of community organizing, I always feel, is organizing people when you become passionate about an issue. And so anyway, I say all that just to say I think that's always the first step. And I think that you start there, you'll generally be in a pretty good position. But yeah, just be expecting to learn on the job. And there are a lot of surprises for you and for those you're going against too. They always underestimate community organizers. So you get some wins in there too, believe it or not.
Awesome. Well, I think that was a great question to finish up with, just kind of a call to action, I think, for all of us in terms of either where to get started or kind of where to continue going in terms of thinking about what types of issues we want to organize around, how we want to advocate. And like you said, just really the emphasis on community and relationships at the center of that. So appreciate that. Brad, do you want to?
I just want to say, hey, Eugene, it was really a pleasure that you reconnected with me again and provided all of your knowledge and your wisdom around activism, organizing, reporting, critical media, looking at historical forces, and in terms of just trying to make a better world. So I've been inspired by you, and I'm really appreciative of that. And I just wanted to thank all of the attendees for coming, the College of Education, the administration, my colleagues in the EDD program, Brian, and it was a great night, and I will hope to reconnect with you soon. Maybe it'll be face-to-face, Eugene, when we're at the Equity and Social Justice Conference, maybe next year. Let's hope it happens.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Brad. Brian, thank you so much. And everybody who joined, I'm really, really, really grateful. Thank y'all.
All right, everyone.
Hopefully you get some sleep. I know it's late on the East Coast. Hopefully you get some sleep, and the rest of you have a great weekend as well. Take care.
Right on. Take care, everybody.
All right, bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.